Hey everyone, I'm back again. All right, today we're going to hear chapter 7. It's called The End of the Race. Pretty good chapter. When the Lady Wilma entered the blue bay of port, Jack counted 31 sailing ships at anchor. He was disappointed that nowhere to be seen was the high-riding Sea Raven. "She's loaded up with coal and fresh water," snapped Captain Swain. "Already loaded up and skedaddled." Nevertheless, smiles were the order of the day. After months at sea, the gold seekers looked upon the sunny little town as if it were Paris or London. They couldn't wait to go ashore. Hardly had the mooring lines been thrown out like bullwhips than the men were trying to leap to the wharf in Peru. "Master Jack, shall we go ashore?" said Praiseworthy. "I'd like that fine," smiled Jack. Jack posted another letter home to Boston. The streets thronged with sailors and gold seekers, and in the distance the great Andes rose up like painted scenery. The town wasn't a great deal larger than the ship that they had just left at the fueling wharf, but it was dry land, and Jack had almost forgotten the smell of dust in his nostrils. He breathed it in like perfume. The butler and the boy rode about on mules, and the day had all the excitement of a picnic. Late in the afternoon, Mr. Rosario Jones hailed them in the sunny plaza. "Look here," he beamed at them. "I bought the last pick and shovel left in town, and since the California fever started, the shelves are bare. I can tell you, and a washpan thrown in for good measure. They're all yours." "Voila," said Monsieur Gaunt, appearing out of the crowd and dropping a pick and shovel at their feet also. "I have got my hands on the last ones in town, and a washpan too, my friends." Then they stopped to glare at the Yankee trader, who was already glaring at him. "Gentlemen," said Praiseworthy, smiling, "I think that we can safely say that you have found the last 2 picks and shovels left here in Calico. They're bound to bring us luck, Master Jack and I." His words of gratitude were interrupted by the clanging of the Lady Wilma's bell, calling all gold seekers back to their ship. "Hurry, boys," shouted Mountain Jim. "The wild bull of the seas would be mighty glad to leave without us." There was a wild rush for the wharf, but when Jack turned, Praiseworthy was no longer standing beside him. Jack's hair nearly stood on end. The butler was gone. "Praiseworthy, Praiseworthy!" he shouted. The ship's bell rang through the air again, but Jack didn't know which way to run. He couldn't leave Praiseworthy behind. Hadn't he heard the ship's warning bell? What had happened to him? "Praiseworthy, Praiseworthy!" he shouted again. Jack was unable to move, as if anchored to the spot by his pick and shovel. He had to fight back a welling of tears, and the Lady Wilma would leave without them if they didn't hurry. And then, from the doorway of a nearby shop, the butler appeared, tall and elegant in his bowler hat and his white gloves. He carried a new pick and shovel over one shoulder, the washpan under his arm, and a strange-looking package wrapped up in newspaper and string dangling freely from his hand. Jack had never been so happy to see anyone else in his life. "Hurry, hurry," he cried desperately. "We're going to get left behind." "Not likely," said Praiseworthy. "I had to stop off and make a small purchase for our good captain himself. Come along, Master Jack." Jack tried not to let Praiseworthy see that he had been very close to tears. He threw the pick and shovel across one shoulder, gathered up the washpan, and together the boy and the butler hurried towards the wharf. One by one, alley cats picked up their trail. By the time they reached the ship, it looked as if every stray cat in Calico was after them. Before the gangway could be raised, at least a dozen assorted cats followed Praiseworthy aboard the ship. In their stocking caps, the crew was too busy throwing off hawsers and preparing for sea to bother with the invasion of Peruvian cats. Here's a picture of the town and the cats that are following Praiseworthy and Jack back to the ship. Jack dropped the heavy pick and shovel with a clang to the deck and looked at Praiseworthy's package. "Do you have a dead rat in there?" he asked. "Hardly," said the butler. "Cheese? Not likely." "Fresh kidney?" "Exactly," said Praiseworthy, raising the package out of the reach of the cats. "Captain Swain is extraordinarily fond of kidney pie. I promised to teach the cook an old recipe that my great-great-grandfather used to prepare for the Duke of Chisley." But at that moment, Captain Swain was in no temper for any kidney pie. The ship had taken on fresh water, but not an ounce of coal. Blast that sea raven, he was bellowing. She filled her bunkers and piled her decks with coal. Hills of it, mountains of it, taking every last one to be had. She's made sure that there is no cinder left for us. Once at sea, the Lady Wilma picked up a friendly breeze. If her coal bunkers were empty, she was at least lighter in the water and went skimming over her course. The Peruvian cats learned to bound out of sight every time the husky-throated boatswain came along, threatening to toss them overboard into the sea. In an unguarded moment, a snap of the wind carried off Praiseworthy's bowler hat. It went tumbling into the sea, filled with water, and sank, never to be seen again. Praiseworthy was left speechless and hatless. For 3 or 4 days, he was not quite himself after this. He missed the hat. He hardly felt like a butler without it, but Jack thought he looked just fine. A week later, as the heat bore down on the deck, Praiseworthy began tying a handkerchief around his head. Jack liked that even better. "You look like a pirate," he smiled at Praiseworthy. "Nonsense, Master Jack," said Praiseworthy. Hoping for a supply of coal, Captain Swain dropped anchor in the Galapagos. But there was nothing to be had except a few cords of stove wood on the barren island, and there was even less to see except the sharks in the bay. The Lady Wilma pushed on. With the rush for gold, steamers were only just being seen around the Horn to the Pacific, and the fueling stops were rare. Weeks later, off the coast of Mexico, a sudden excitement raced along the decks of the gold ship. The Sea Raven had been sighted again. She was lumbering through the sea, low in the water, weighted down by her extra tons of coal. They stood in enormous black piles on her weathered decks. "Billy be hanged," shouted Mountain Jim. "We're going to pass her by." Jack stood in the ratlines, and his heart raced with delight. The Sea Raven looked almost half sunk in the sea. Her passengers could be seen at the rails, glum and silent, as the Lady Wilma pulled ahead of them. "By grabs," yelled Captain Swain, beaming, doing a little jig in the paddle box. "I guess there's something heavier than a ton of bricks, a ton of coal. That should make a difference." By the time the brown hills of California appeared off the port side, the Lady Wilma was well at the lead. Meanwhile, the Peruvian cats had Peruvian babies. "I'll drown 'em, every single one of them," swore the boatswain. But he had to catch them first. They ran for cover whenever he approached, disappeared within seconds. They found every hiding place aboard that ship and had invented new hiding places. Jack tried hard to ignore them, for good luck had taught him a lesson. But in the end, he was putting out galley scraps at night for them. Every morsel would be gone by morning. Dr. Buckbee spent his days fishing, and the lines tied around his peg leg. He would drowse in the sun until a tug would rouse him, and then his back was turned, the fish would disappear as if into thin air. The wily cats grew fatter and fatter. As San Francisco and the end of their long voyage drew nearer, the gold seekers began to trim their beards again. They packed and repacked their sea chests. They scrubbed their clothes, and they hummed and whistled and sang a little tune. "I'm going to California with the washboard on my knee." Jack's thoughts raced ahead to the gold fields. What would it be like? Would there be grizzly bears and outlaws and wild Indians? Certainly, he told himself. It was an untamed place, California, wasn't it? What was the use of an untamed place if there weren't wild animals and Indians and outlaws? "We ought to have a gun," he told Praiseworthy. "A gun? Why?" "To protect ourselves," said Jack. "Stuff and nonsense," said the butler. But Jack noticed the other gold seekers busily cleaning their sidearms and rifles and sharpening their knives. He wished they had a gun. A 4-shooter maybe, or even an old army musket with a bayonet. One bright morning, with San Francisco not more than a day's run, the bountiful winds died away again. By afternoon, clouds had gathered in the sky, and headwinds bore down on the gold ship as if to drive her back in her wake. With steam in her boilers, the Sea Raven came steadily on course. By dusk, she had caught up to the Lady Wilma, passing with a wild shout of glee and a victorious blast of her whistle at them. "Boys," said Mountain Jim, "it looks like we're done for." "Not a bit," said Praiseworthy. On his way to the pilot house, the Lady Wilma was already making a wide tack in the wind. She may be blown hundreds of miles off course. even as far as the Sandwich Islands. The voyage isn't finished, sir, though, not by a long shot. But even to Jack, with the wind snapping in his shirt, it seemed that the Lady Wilma's luck had run out. Captain Swain would lose command of the new clipper ship building on the bays of Boston. Jack dug his hands in his pockets and glanced up at the pilot house. The wild bull of the seas didn't have a lump of coal to fight those headwinds. Jack was asleep in his hammock when he was aroused by a strange sound. At first he thought it must be Mr. Rosario Jones snoring in his sleep, or maybe Mountain Jim, or maybe Dr. Buckbee. But they all came awake too. There was a deep throb that was running through the ship, and then another one. Then a splash of the side wheels could be heard. Then another, and another. And the gold seekers bounded out of their bunks and summoned their nightcaps and collected on the deck. Sparks were flying out of the funnel. Steam had been built up in the boilers again. "What's the captain burning?" said Mountain Jim, scratching his wet red whiskers. "Is he burning cats?" "Hardly," said Praiseworthy above the crash of the side wheels. He gave Jack a wink. "Neither cats, nor bricks, nor spoiled potatoes. As any stowaway could tell you, gentlemen, we're carrying lumber in our cargo bins. Thousands of feet of lumber enough to build a whole hotel." It occurred to Captain Swain to make a purchase of what he needs with the ship's fuel accounts. Makes a fine shower of sparks, doesn't it? But the race was not won yet, and Jack could sleep no more that night. He pulled on an old pea jacket and frog-voiced boatswain had handed to him, and stood with Praiseworthy at the rail of the ship. This would be their last night aboard the ship after all. The paddle wheels whirled faster and faster, and the bowsprit came on course like a compass needle. "It was you, wasn't it?" grinned Master Jack. "Me, Master Jack?" said Praiseworthy. "You told the captain about the lumber, didn't you?" "Oh, he knew it was there, but with all his storming about the bricks in the hold, he hadn't stopped to give the lumber a single thought. I merely reminded him, you might say." In the dark of the morning, the Lady Wilma had managed to gain onto the Sea Raven. The gold ship's thrashing bowsprit, and the red glow of the smokestacks lit up the surrounding sea. "More lumber!" screamed Captain Swain into his voice tube. "I want every ounce of lumber into that boiler! Then some more!" he screamed. The Sea Raven, too, was making a final sprint. By noon, the Golden Gate stood ahead of them. Not the bridge. It's called the Golden Gate, that opening into San Francisco. But the extra burden of her mountain and coal decks was much too much for the Sea Raven. Beat by beat of her side wheels, the Lady Wilma pulled slowly ahead. Wood sparks showered from her funnel. She entered the sparkling narrows of the Golden Gate and finally came out into San Francisco Bay. The city stretched out across the sand dunes like something that had sprung up the night before. There seemed to be more ships in the harbor than houses on the shore. "Let's go to anchor!" yelled Captain Swain, shouting from his pilot house window. A moment later, the anchor chain went rattling into the bay, and hats went flying into the air, and beaver hats and straw hats, and even a cat or two went flying into the air. Praiseworthy and Jack gathered up their picks and their shovels and their washpans and their carpet bags, and they peered at the golden hills of San Francisco. The houses looked like packing boxes with roofs and tents of every description that were pitched along the dunes of the shore. "Gentlemen," said Praiseworthy, tugging on his white gloves, "I believe that we actually won the race." After 15,000 miles of voyage and 5 months at sea, the gold seekers had finally arrived in California. Now the story gets really good. So that was chapter 7. I hope you enjoyed it. There's going to be, I believe, another Kahoot that I'm going to put onto the Google Classroom for after this chapter. I believe it's for chapters 5 and 6, so you'll have a bit of time. I miss you all. I hope you're doing well, and over and out for today.